Welcome to Accommodate This. My name is David, and I'm a late diagnosed autistic adult. I make content about the neurodivergent experience, so if that's something you're interested in, please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. Imagine if mistakes were celebrated. One of my previous employers, Primera Blue Cross, used to celebrate the discovery of mistakes, which they called opportunities. And to them, mistakes were considered a chance to re-examine how we do things, to shore up weaknesses in our systems and processes. And this idea stems from the concept of kaizen, which is a Japanese word that loosely translates to good change. In essence, it's beneficial for the company to promote continuous improvement through small changes. Exposing mistakes allows you to make faster corrections and work on solutions to prevent similar mistakes in the future. And because people are more likely to want to hide their mistakes, celebrating their discovery is imperative to reduce the stigma about them. And that's what I'd like to talk about this week. So now that you know why we're here, let's get into the topic for this video: mistake proofing. I most recently worked for a health insurance company called Molina Healthcare. Hashtag shame on Molina. There are several lists of the top insurance companies in the US, but the one I found shows Molina listed as number 9 in the list of top 25 health insurance companies in the US. And they have retained about 1.99% of the market share. And market share points to the competitiveness, the financial health, the structure and security of the company. And insurance companies with higher market shares typically collect higher premium amounts and have a more extensive network of providers. Considering the many different health insurance companies out there, being number 9 is a pretty big deal and means you're working with a lot of money all the time. If you've seen some of my earlier videos, you may already know that I was wrongfully terminated from Molina after reporting abuse and misconduct on my team. When the bullying I experienced reached its apex, Joe Zubretsky, the CEO of Molina Healthcare, stepped in and told HR to fix this. What did that mean? It's hard to say. But they happened to be in the middle of a lawsuit defending against the very same abuse I had reported. They decided to put me on a leave to investigate, though they quickly agreed I was in a toxic environment and removed me from my position. Did they address the issues with my manager? No, they sided with her and refused to talk to my witnesses and resources. Then, despite me not working a day with the accommodations I asked for, they claimed they did accommodate me. The icing on the cake was when Molina tried to bribe me with $46,000 in exchange for my silence. All I had to do was sign the non-disclosure agreement, but I have too much integrity to be bribed like that. Besides, after all the gaslighting and abuse I suffered there, as well as the abuse that I witnessed, I was not about to give up my right to talk about these experiences. And as sad as it may be, I still care about the mission and vision of that company, whether they truly do or not. And I still care about many of the people who are still working there, despite the damage that some of them did to me. And my hope is by making their corruption more visible, Molina and companies like them might finally take responsibility to actually address the root causes of their issues, rather than investing in cover-ups. And that would not only benefit Molina, but also their staff and the communities that they claim to serve. Alexander Pope put it best when he said, "To err is human, to forgive divine." While none of us should be surprised when someone makes a mistake, forgiveness is often withheld. There's a tendency to become frustrated when mistakes are made. And I get it. I don't like making mistakes, especially if a mistake is going to negatively impact other people. However, there's good reason for businesses to be wary of errors because every year in the US, human error and poor data quality cost about $3.1 trillion and an average of 10,000 lives. For those reasons and many more, it makes sense to do what we can to reduce the occurrence of errors. Now, most of my working career was spent in support and training positions where facts mattered and precision and accuracy made all the difference in our success. Being able to look at issues objectively was an important skill because emotions could easily lead a person to focus on the wrong issues. Over the years, I became quite good at identifying gaps in processes and developing solutions to simplify and streamline them. And while the ability to identify errors is important, I focused heavily on avoiding errors before they happened, which brings me to the concept of poka-yoke. Poka-yoke is another Japanese term that means error-proofing, or fail-safing, fail-proofing, or error avoidance. The concept of poka-yoke acknowledges that whenever you work with imperfect beings, mistakes are going to occur. But we can put guardrails in place to prevent them. In essence, we can design systems and processes that make it impossible, or at least more difficult, to make mistakes. And at the very least, systems should make mistakes easily detectable so they can quickly and easily be resolved. Poka-yoke and Kaizen are two of many concepts that are part of a larger, multifaceted methodology known as Lean. Some of the core principles of Lean can be traced all the way back to the late 1800s. So these concepts have been around for a while. However, the term Lean itself was coined in 1988 to describe the efficiency of Toyota's production systems from the 1940s. Then, in the early 2000s, Lean methodology began to work its way into the healthcare industry. And despite Toyota having practically nothing in common with health insurance, Lean principles had a proven record at reducing wasteful practices, so it became a point of interest for many insurance companies. And for health insurance companies in particular, eliminating wasteful practices and error-proofing systems and processes can actually result in saving lives. Fortunately, autistic brains are very good at error-proofing. In general, we are very logic-based and natural pattern seekers, and we are quite sensitive to details most people disregard. Our desire for precision and accuracy sometimes leads others to think of us as too literal, but nobody can match our desire to avoid doing harm. The downside is that many of us also have chronic anxiety, because we are constantly being told to ignore the dangers that we see. To us, the world is full of unnecessary chaos, which leaves us in a constant state of survival. As for myself, I'm sometimes so risk-averse that I find it difficult to move forward at all until it's safe to do so. This concept is also known as pathological demand avoidance, or PDA, and we may need help with remaining calm and collected in the presence of perceived dangers. Being forced forward without addressing those perceived dangers can result in meltdowns or shutdowns, which aren't fun for anyone. Most experts would agree that the first step to address potential errors is to understand them and identify potential causes. Then either take the necessary steps to mitigate errors or accept the risks that they pose. The point is to prevent, or at least detect and weed out defects as early as possible in the process. And every step after that is made on more sure footing. And if a mistake occurs, the use of simple poka-yoke mechanisms and other safeguards can keep those mistakes from becoming catastrophic events. However, this approach is contingent on dedication, constant feedback, self-discipline, and appropriate checks to ensure each step of the process is operating as expected. My last employer, Molina Healthcare, claimed to comply with lean methodologies. And they still make that claim to this day, as you can see them mention it in many of their job descriptions online. Yet when I tried to apply lean principles during my employment with Molina, I was punished by leaders who had no concept of lean or its methodologies. Despite lean concepts being fundamentally non-personal, I was accused of making personal attacks. For example, my manager asked me to perform an audit and then told me I was personally attacking others when I offered suggestions. I wasn't even judging. I was literally saying things like, consider XYZ, and leaving it up to them to decide if that's the route they wanted to go. Their snap judgments were purely emotional and lacked any deep understanding of the issues. This made them quick to project their problems onto me rather than listen to reason. I often tried to educate my team about lean because it became quite clear that they knew very little about it. And yet, if you asked them if lean was embraced by Molina, the response was typically a resounding yes. But it was clear they did not have a deep understanding of lean principles. For example, I let my leaders know about errors and possible causes for them. A perfect example of the stop the line concept. Stop the line is a lean concept that empowers all employees to stop production in order to avoid errors before they are made. This allows for risks to be examined and worked out before causing any damage. But my leadership at Molina became offended when I identified errors and began associating errors with me as if I were the cause. They told me to stop notifying them of issues I would uncover, as if that would stop the flood of mistakes from being made. Not only was that a foolish decision, it was also in complete conflict with fundamental lean ideology. They did not understand the principles of Kanban, which allows for proper tracking of work as it passes through different hands, or Andon, which alerts staff to issues that require immediate attention. When used together, Kanban and Andon have been proven to streamline processes and reduce errors. When I tried to help them apply these concepts, it was rarely received with open minds. They did not understand the concept of fail forward fast, which acknowledges there will be failures, but it encourages us to keep moving forward and to learn by doing. They preferred to keep their failures secret, never really exhibiting forethought, and refused to learn from past mistakes to prevent future issues. They did not understand the concepts of 5S, which are about identifying and eliminating waste. These include sort, simplify or straighten, sweep or shine, standardize, and self-discipline or sustain. Any of my attempts to eliminate waste were taken as personal attacks. They did not understand the concept of an inch wide and a mile deep, which suggests we try to understand the work in such great detail that we can become experts in handling it with less risk. All of these concepts and more exist under the lean umbrella. And yet Molina leadership preferred to hold errors at a distance, insisted any criticism of systemic and policy issues were personal attacks, and would only look at errors superficially. To them, mistakes were icky. So they approached errors with disgust and a general aversion to learning anything about what was happening, as if it was beneath them in some way. And what was even worse is they were in complete denial about the mistakes being made by leadership at all. Sure, we could have discussions about what to do about errors, but they could never get their minds past enforcing punishments and absolutely refused to accept any personal responsibility for their teams. I'm sure many of you have worked for or with someone who refused to take responsibility for their contributions to the issues. And leaders like that tend to only want to solve simple issues, but refuse to plan ahead to avoid them for the long term. It's as if they chose not to prevent issues because such efforts would go unnoticed. They only preferred solving issues when they would be guaranteed to receive praise for it. And studies have shown that it is common for management to attribute successful outcomes to themselves, accepting the praise that comes with it, while dissociating themselves from anything related to a mistake. While managers are also human and therefore capable of making mistakes, they often underplay their own mistakes or refuse to accept them or take responsibility for them. This was definitely the case at Molina, and it placed myself and the other trainers in a constant cycle of training and retraining staff, which had steep costs of its own. For example, while staff were in class, they weren't working through existing inventory. So not only was the company paying the trainers for our time, they were also paying for every person in class, while the backlog of work continued to pile up. So not only was this a big risk, um, the benefits needed to outweigh the costs in order to justify it. Unfortunately, at Molina, our hands were often tied with red tape and knowledge firewalls that hindered our ability to provide valuable training. So instead of looking at training as an investment, leadership at Molina believed that the amount of time spent in training was a waste. And instead of listening to us and addressing our issues in meaningful ways, they insisted on maximum results with minimal investment. There were many reasons for this. One, training was often focused on addressing the wrong issues. Two, learned concepts were not rehearsed outside of class, making them easy for people to forget. And three, proposed courses were often lacking details that were not provided to the trainers ahead of time, yet we were still expected to teach those details. And this resulted in a cycle of waste and general belief that training was a useless practice. But training issues at Molina stemmed from a lack of examination of what needed to be trained in the first place. And so leadership's refusal to look beyond the surface only confirmed their biases and made matters worse. Unfortunately, at Molina, they never examined errors beyond their initial intuitions. To them, there was no need to look deeper once they identified who was making which errors and how often. They relied on emotions, refused to test assumptions, and focused on where to place blame. And as a result, they never truly understood the root causes for the errors being made. Instead, they would immediately turn to punishments, which only served to deepen the divide between leadership and staff. And that's one thing I don't really get. Maybe it's because I'm autistic, and there's probably some social nuance I don't understand, but in my view, leadership spends all this time and effort looking for the right employee. They find someone they believe is qualified and establish a contract agreement where both sides agree to trust one another, and then immediately turn on the employee when a mistake is uncovered. Instead of helping them, they simply assert that improvements are expected and leave it up to the employee to figure out how to get there. It's bizarre to me. Instead, leadership should remember that people are going to make mistakes, but then establish standards and systems that make it harder to make mistakes, or at the very least, make it easier to identify mistakes quickly. They should invest in helping their employees be successful, not leave it all up to the employees to figure it out. And I admit that I have a tendency to be a perfectionist, which is quite common for autistics, and it's difficult for me to sometimes recognize how subjective some rules may be. In my mind, if you say the goal is 100% and then are okay with 80%, I'm going to wonder why you didn't set the goal at 80% in the first place. My autistic brain wants to make sense of these things, and I admit I can get a bit caught up in the details sometimes. However, I was fortunate enough to have some good leaders before working at Molina. One of my previous leaders, who I respected quite a bit, told me 80% is sometimes good enough because it's still progress. And she was right. Over the years, I've learned that that can be true for a lot of things. So I fight my natural tendency for the greater good. Besides, we shouldn't let our fear of risks posed by the remaining 20% prevent us from moving forward at all, because if you never get out of the planning phase, you aren't really making any progress. At some point, you have to take the first step and put all your plans to the test. And sometimes things may still go wrong despite all our planning, but we may never know until we take action. On the other hand, that doesn't mean planning isn't necessary. I mean, I lose sleep at night knowing there are people who believe that making mistakes is the best way to learn. And while I agree that we can learn from mistakes, that approach seems far from ideal to me. I prefer a cautious approach with a mind focused on preventing as much damage as possible. I struggle to understand why anyone would be happy about making mistakes. And yet, I love the concept of poka-yoke, which celebrates making mistakes visible because it's ultimately about becoming better. It's about shoring up weaknesses, reinforcing those blind spots, and becoming more effective and less error-prone. Yet Molina treated mistakes as a taboo topic to be hidden at all costs. So I would get in trouble for talking about errors and ways to solve them. I guess shame on me for taking them at their word that they were interested in preventing mistakes. Like many other companies, Molina Healthcare rarely ever examined anything beyond a superficial level, and acted as though the appearance of doing well was the same as actually doing well. They refused to put the responsibility back on leadership in any degree. And this is a common mistake many companies make. According to a study by NASA in 2016, companies like Molina tend to address errors in the following ineffective ways: punish the individual who made an error and create remedial training, emphasize accountability, create team strategies and improve communication, put multiple layers of policy and procedural protection in place, and introduce cultural approaches. Despite their problems, I generally trust what NASA has to say because they've been able to send people to the moon and back. And we can learn a lot from their findings if we're willing to understand them. And it shouldn't be that hard, right? After all, health insurance is complex, but it's not rocket science. And yet, too often, leadership at Molina took the stance of punishing people for making mistakes. Yearly goals were based less on making actual improvements and more on making leadership or their teams look good to justify a 3% merit increase. Because they had a habit of hiding their mistakes, they struggled to define what success looked like, making it impossible for us to establish workable goals. But that didn't stop them from pushing us to our breaking point to earn a few extra dollars while they were spending millions to hide their fraud and abuse. Essentially, they created an environment of superficiality and competition and incentivized brushing errors under the rug. Inevitably, the frequency of errors would continue to grow, which impacted the health of Molina's customers and employees, forcing leadership to take action. And their plan of action usually took the form of tasking me and the other trainers to provide random training sessions with little more than a topic idea. This superficial understanding of the errors and how training was supposed to work were big problems. Audits showed how often errors were made and who made them, but the causes for those errors, they just seemed arbitrary. Without viewing the details, it was impossible to identify the root causes, and in turn made it impossible to create effective solutions. I and the other trainers pointed this out time and again, and we advised that we were incapable of providing effective training without understanding the root causes for the errors, but we were not allowed to view the details of the audit findings. We were forced to blindly train and retrain based on speculation in hopes that we would stumble across some magical combination of words that would make the information stick in the minds of the staff committing the errors, because of course it had to be an employee issue. It was a very non-strategic approach, and it's no surprise that errors persisted despite all the training sessions we offered. And yet, because of how superficial they were, Molina leadership suspected we were not trying hard enough to deliver effective training. When I pointed out our approach was faulty, that we needed to establish standard work, that we needed to eliminate gray areas and to focus on improving our systems and processes, all lean concepts. My critiques were taken personally, and they retaliated by accusing me of being judgmental. And while everyone was pointing fingers at the next person, asserting there needed to be more accountability, nobody was getting closer to understanding and solving the issues. And this created an unending cycle of errors that just got worse and worse over time. Instead of focusing on the number of errors and who was making them, the deeper question to ask ourselves was, why does the system allow errors to be made in the first place? But rather than adapting processes and systems to make it more difficult to make mistakes, leaders at Molina resorted to childish finger pointing and punishing staff for being human. They could not see how their resistance to examine processes deeper, make more informed decisions, and establish safeguards were contributing to the errors that they saw. And instead of simplifying and standardizing processes, they chose to tighten their control and press their positions of authority to scare staff into doing better. But that would never work if the underlying understanding of the errors remained unknown. So they decided to improve communication by adding layer upon layer of bureaucracy that discouraged two-way communication. Instead of improving error visibility and empowering leadership to monitor staff, they forced staff to meticulously report every detail of their daily work and ignored staff concerns. For example, I was a salaried employee. I wasn't paid by the hour, and yet I had to report my time 3 separate ways every week. And it was worse for hourly employees who had 4 different time cards. And even though we were told to report our concerns on a weekly basis, I was told to stop reporting mine. HR even told me they were trying to reduce the number of reported incidents, not the incidents themselves, just the reporting of them. At the same time, procedural information was disseminated using the spray and pray approach. They would rely on announcements, procedures, and random emails that employees had to keep track of. And in my experience, this not only diluted the pool of information, it opened it up for inconsistencies. In previous positions, I created effective audit processes, documented and compiled hundreds of policies and procedures, and was even asked to lead the procedures team because I was so effective. Yet at Molina, they preferred multiple layers of confusing procedural documentation. They refused to listen to my suggestions even after soliciting my feedback. And my suggestions were tried and true concepts that worked in the past to standardize and streamline processes to make it easier for staff to find the information that they needed. Still, leadership refused to focus on the efficacy of their documentation, arrogantly claiming that any convolution could be attributed to staff not having the capacity to understand, instead of writing procedures to assist staff in completing their work without errors. Leadership used procedural documentation to support disciplinary processes designed to protect leadership. And any attempts I made to address issues with the documentation were taken as personal attacks or considered offensive to Molina culture. In these ways and more, Molina embodied all the incorrect ways to address errors, which resulted in poor job satisfaction, work backlogs, unnecessary stress, and high employee turnover. Their denial of taking personal responsibility and their tendency to place blame on whistleblowers contributed to a toxic work environment that dissolved any trust between staff and leadership. In fact, I'd never seen a higher rate of staff going on paid leave before in my life. And the costs related to all of it, including training new staff over and over again, were significantly greater than they needed to be. Instead of simply professing that they embraced lean, Molina should have actually embraced lean by objectively studying errors, why they occur, and ways to prevent them or to make them more visible. They should have relied less on emotion and intuition, focusing more on data, logic, and reasoning, which happened to be part of the feedback they received in their yearly employee surveys. Unfortunately, Molina Healthcare is terrible when it comes to mistake proofing, and they waste millions of dollars avoiding what needs to be addressed. They let their egos get in the way of seeing what is right in front of them. Tying this back with autism, their insistence on conformity with faulty practices took a huge toll on my nervous system. I don't think they realized how much effort it took for me to look past the errors that I saw, or how isolating it was for me to be the only one speaking up about them. Despite my appearance, I have a medically diagnosed disability that hinders my ability to communicate and to understand social situations. But instead of listening to the substance of my message and trusting my proven track record, they focused on superficial aspects like tone, which became increasingly more difficult for me to control the longer they resisted addressing the issues that I raised. And they used this to strawman me and dismiss me all the time. My mental health sank because of the constant dismissal, their insistence on fostering a culture of blame, and for forbidding any examination of root causes that might involve leadership. It hurt me to see so many people who I dedicated weeks of my time training fall into states of confusion and to be ignored when they cried for help. It was hard for me to watch as leadership insisted on wasting so much time, energy, and money on baseless theories that never reached deep enough to make a real difference. And it was abusive for Molina leadership to both blame staff for making errors and expecting staff to fix all the issues contributing to the errors, especially when that staff doesn't have the power to affect real change. The impact on me was so severe, I developed PTSD that the doctor said was off the charts, requiring immediate surgical intervention. This is important because, like many insurance companies these days, Molina Healthcare is padding the pocketbooks of their board members at the cost of worsening the health of our nation, all while contributing to the uneven wealth distribution of millions of Americans. Molina, in particular, has settled or been found at fault and penalized in 63 lawsuits just since 2001. Most of which were consumer protection-related offenses. Unfortunately, the payouts over that entire time frame amounted to little over $15 million, which hardly seems like a penalty when you consider they pay their CEO over $20 million per year. And that's mostly through his stock options, which are often not taxed, or they're taxed at a much lower rate once sold. In fact, the highest paid CEO of 2023 was Andrew Whitty of United Health Group, whose compensation was over $23.5 million. That's more than double the amount of Brian Thompson. And Brian Thompson was the one who was murdered. The second highest paid CEO was Joe Zubretsky of Molina Healthcare, whose compensation was over $22 million in 2023. Their refusal to address mistakes with any real objective effort is hurting people. For instance, they were most recently fined $100,000 for enrollment and billing errors that affected more than 2,000 people in Washington, which is only one of the 19 states they operate in across the nation. This pales in comparison to the two fines they paid in 2022 of $4.6 million each for violations of the False Claims Act, which governs fraudulent billing practices. Although the exact numbers of people impacted by these violations are unknown, reports indicate that thousands of members were likely impacted in each case. And these are only 3 of the 63 lawsuits I mentioned that occurred over the last 24 years. Despite the huge impact these issues have had on thousands of lives, the fines are embarrassingly disproportionate, especially for a company of their size. If Molina actually cared about serving our communities, they would take effective steps to address errors like the ones they've been sued for. However, many of the lawsuits have been settled with non-disclosure agreements that serve to bury the main extent of the damages they caused. If they really wanted to do better, Molina would seek out the best, most capable employees and educate them on standards and practices that matter. Instead, Molina targets deliberately low-income areas to hire staff at a lower monthly cost, and then avoids arming them with the knowledge and support they need to do well in their jobs. I myself was solicited to apply, promised a position I didn't get, and was denied formal training for the one I was assigned to. If Molina really cared about doing the right thing, they wouldn't continue to lie about their sketchy practices. For example, as recently as April 2024, the CEO, Joe Zubretsky, reported that Medicaid rates were increased in order to compensate for the rise in costs related to an aging population. However, Medicaid is for low-income citizens. Medicare is for the elderly. And despite experiencing a net loss in Medicaid membership, they still made record profits under Medicaid. So in other words, Molina made profits on the backs of the low-income members they retained, who were forced to pay higher premiums under the guise of an unrelated lie about an aging population. And before you dismiss this as something that doesn't impact you, let's not forget that much of their money comes from your tax dollars. Molina has received government funding for over 40 years in order to administer their Medicare, Medicaid, and Marketplace programs. On top of that, they also collect billions of dollars in premiums each year. In 2024, they made a profit of about $38 billion and made roughly $32 billion the year before. Ironically, they could be making even more money if they would honestly and objectively examine errors and their root causes. But profits are great enough and penalties are small enough that they have no incentive to do better. As a health insurance carrier, they are tremendously wasteful and inefficient. But as a money-making machine, they're doing just fine, which is enough for their board members. I guess if that's their goal, then good for them. And it makes sense why they wield so much power over these insurance companies when they literally own large percentages of them in the form of stocks. However, they're deceiving people, professing to serve communities and to care about the people living there. In reality, they are notorious for their high rates of denials, even when services were previously authorized. In 2023, Molina was rated as having the highest denial rate in the country, at about 17.7%. The next highest is CareSource at 15.4%, followed by United Healthcare at 13.6%. Sure, Molina spends about 83% of their funds on medical costs, which is above the 80% required under the law, but they retain the other 17% for themselves. Just over 2.5% pays for employees, and another 1% for overhead. They spend another 3.5% or so on charitable contributions, which they get back in the form of donations, tax breaks, and public recognition. Meanwhile, their CEO gets paid more than 278 times the average pay of his employees each year, thanks in large part to earnings he gets from stock options. They are gambling with money that includes your well-earned tax dollars, willingly denying life-saving care, hiding their unsafe practices, and they are indifferent about the damages they cause. All in all, Molina has a long way to go to get on track with their mission and vision. They claim to be conservative with their funds, but I've shown they are anything but. Because of rampant leadership corruption and a toxic culture, they are benefiting more from maintaining the status quo, despite it costing businesses trillions of dollars and thousands of lives every year. Because even with their current practices, they could pay more toward healthcare if they truly were concerned about the health of our communities, but they don't. It's unfortunate that Molina, a Fortune 500 company with over 5 million members and 18,000 employees, has chosen time and again to ignore what matters while collecting government funds. Every day, they have a new opportunity to do the right thing, and every day so far, they have chosen to do the wrong thing, to punish whistleblowers, to reward abusive practices such as conformity over conscience, ignoring and subverting government regulations while collecting government funds, and avoid taking responsibility for their actions. And because of the corruption in our current economic, legal, and political systems, Molina continues to get away with it. They need to do better. We need to demand better. And by doing so, we can invite Kaizen, or good change, into the future. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment, like, and subscribe to see more content like this, or click on the video here to continue watching.